I remember the exact moment the world went silent. Not because the room was quiet, but because my body stopped responding and the only thing keeping me alive was the stubborn pulse inside my chest refusing to give up. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move my fingers, couldn't scream for help, but I could hear everything, every whisper, every step, every voice that walked into that hospital room thinking I was gone or on my way out. And in that stillness, in that terrifying cage of consciousness trapped inside an unresponsive body, I heard the one thing I never thought I'd hear in my lifetime: my husband and his mistress discussing my funeral as casually as someone choosing a color for their living room walls. I remember her voice first, sharp and impatient, saying my condition was inconvenient and asking him how long the doctors said I'd last. I remember him sighing, annoyed, as if my potential death was just another chore in his week, and saying, "They think she won't make it. Maybe a day or two. We should start deciding things." And then he said it. He said, "It's better this way." I felt something inside me break so violently that if my body had been able to tremble, the bed would have shaken. I wanted to scream, to tell them I could hear, to tell the nurses, to grab his wrist and drag him down with me. But all I could do was listen as they planned the details of a funeral I was very much alive to witness. The nurse who walked in moments later was the first human presence that didn't feel like a predator entering a cage. She checked the machines, fixed my pillow, adjusted the blanket, and then froze. I didn't see it, but I felt the shift in her breathing, the tension rising inside her. She had heard something. Maybe their tone, maybe a phrase, maybe the way my husband quickly shut up when she entered with a clipboard in hand. She didn't say anything at first, but she stayed longer than she needed to. And then she whispered something so softly I almost thought I imagined it. "If you can hear me, blink." My soul slammed against my eyelids trying to obey. And for the first time since the fall, my left eyelid twitched. It wasn't a blink. Not fully, but it was enough. The nurse gasped softly, stepped closer, and whispered again, "Do it again." I tried. I prayed. I forced every part of me to move something, anything, and the right eyelid trembled. Barely a whisper of movement, but real. She squeezed my hand gently and whispered, "Oh my God, you're in there." But she didn't alert my husband. She didn't tell the mistress. She didn't even change her expression when they returned. Instead, she pretended nothing had happened, finished her routine checks, and left the room as calmly as she came. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, she walked straight to her supervisor and said, "She's responsive." And that one sentence began a chain reaction that saved my life. Doctors returned, tests were run, lights were flashed into my eyes, reflex checks, stimulus responses, and every time they touched my arm or called my name, my body twitched a little more, as if each sound was pulling me back to the surface. The medical team knew before anyone else that I wasn't dying. I was fighting, and the nurse who saw my eyelid tremble became my first line of defense. In the days that followed, the outside world moved like a storm around me. I heard his footsteps whenever he came into the room, heard the frustration in his breathing, heard the forced grief in his voice when staff members were around. But the moment he thought he was alone, his tone changed. He'd say things like, "It would be easier if you'd just go," or "Why couldn't you fall right?" or "You ruined everything." I felt trapped, terrified, screaming in silence. But every time he entered the room, my heart monitor reacted, and that was the clue the team needed. The nurse noticed that the beeping accelerated only when he stepped near me. She told the doctor. The doctor documented it. And little by little, the truth began to push through the cracks he never thought existed. I remember the exact moment the doctor leaned over me and said, "If you can hear me, try to move your eyebrow." My soul pushed forward with everything it had left, and the smallest movement appeared. An eyebrow twitch, then another. The doctor stared for several seconds, and then smiled. A smile I later learned she tried to hide from my husband to avoid tipping him off. The team started testing me regularly, documenting every tiny improvement. My husband, meanwhile, grew more irritated, more nervous, more hostile. I heard him arguing with the mistress in hushed tones in the hallway, something about things getting complicated, about taking care of it, about not letting things slip out of control. But fate was already slipping through his fingers. The day I first tried to make a sound was the day the world shifted permanently. The doctor leaned close, touched my hand, and said, "Try to breathe out with intention. Try to make a sound." I tried. Nothing came out. She asked again. I tried harder. A faint exhale escaped. It wasn't a word, but it was a beginning. The nurse cried. The doctor smiled. My husband panicked. He tried to get the staff out of the room, tried to ask questions he had no right to ask, tried to take control. But the hospital had already begun documenting his behavior. Security was alerted. His visits were supervised. His attempts to isolate me stopped working. Days later, when my first deliberate sound finally formed, it came out as a broken whisper, a breath wrapped in pain, but unmistakable. Va, alive. The nurse sobbed, gripping my hand. The doctor stood frozen, then rushed to activate the legal protocol. Because when a woman they thought unconscious suddenly whispers, alive, right after her husband tried to accelerate her funeral arrangements, there is no longer any room for doubt. That single word changed everything. Security removed him from the hallway. His mistress was banned from the hospital entirely. The medical director ordered full surveillance around my room. Police were notified. And for the first time since the fall, I felt the universe tilt back in my direction. I wasn't safe yet, but I was no longer alone. The second word I ever formed came days later, when the doctor asked, "Can you tell us what happened to you? Anything at all?" I tried. My throat burned. My chest tightened. But then it came out, raw and torn, but unmistakable. Pushed. And everything, every lie he told, every performance he perfected, every excuse he rehearsed, came crashing down. Officers were called, legal procedures were initiated, and the hospital staff stepped into action like a shield around me. When they led him away in handcuffs, I wasn't able to watch. My eyes were still too weak, my body too fragile, but I heard the sound, the clinking metal, the firm commands, the way his breathing shifted from anger to fear. The same fear he had forced into my body for years was finally reflected back at him, and though I couldn't move yet, something inside me stood up for the first time. Something that had been bent and broken and silenced for so long finally straightened. Every hour afterward became a fight toward myself. My fingers began to move, my voice sharpened, my breath deepened. Nurses encouraged me, doctors protected me, the police checked on me, and the hospital became the place where I resurrected piece by piece. When they brought me the mirror, the first time I had seen my face since the fall, I almost looked away. But when I finally met my own reflection, I didn't see what he tried to leave behind. I saw a survivor waking up. I saw a woman who had been pushed off a staircase but climbed back with nothing but willpower and the hands of strangers who cared more about her life than her own husband ever did. I saw someone reborn. And the day I stood up, trembling, sweating, terrified, but standing, even if only for a few seconds, the room erupted into tears. Not pity, triumph. I felt the weight of gravity under my feet, felt the world support me again, and I whispered, "I'm back." The first step came later, a single, clumsy, trembling step that changed everything, a step that said, "You tried to bury me, but I'm walking out of this story alive." When I left the hospital on my own legs weeks later, the sun felt different on my skin, warmer, brighter, like the world had been waiting for me. And when I finally stood in front of a judge, facing the man who had tried to erase me, I said the only sentence that mattered: "I am alive, and I want justice." And that day, justice chose me. Justice chose me, but healing was a different kind of justice, one that didn't come from a courtroom or a judge or a sentence, but from the slow, painful reconstruction of every part of myself he tried to break. After leaving the hospital, I had to relearn what it meant to live without fear. The world outside felt too loud at first, too bright, too full of reminders of the life I lived before the fall. People walked fast, cars passed close, doors slammed unexpectedly, and each noise sent ripples through my chest, as if my body was relearning how to identify danger from memory rather than from reality. But I walked anyway. I walked down ramps, across hallways, through my mother's living room, clinging to furniture sometimes, to walls other times, and to the beating persistence of my own heart, always. Every inch I moved felt like reclaiming territory he tried to burn. When I closed my eyes at night, the memory of the staircase haunted me, the push, the fall, the moment weight disappeared and terror took its place. But now the memory of my first step in the hospital rose beside it, like a second truth, one that slowly drowned the first. I got up. Therapy became my new battlefield. Physical therapy was a negotiation between my body and gravity, between pain and possibility. Some days my legs trembled so violently I could barely stand. Other days my steps were cleaner, steadier, almost confident. My therapist would say, "Don't rush healing. It's not a race. It's a rebuilding." And I swallowed those words like medicine. Emotional therapy, though, that was the deeper cut. Talking about him. Talking about the relationship I once thought was love. Recognizing the patterns, the red flags I mistook for stress, The criticisms I swallowed as truth, the silences I interpreted as my fault. The therapist told me something that stayed with me. It's dangerous when someone teaches you to doubt your own reality, but it's powerful when you reclaim it. And every session felt like taking back another piece of the world he tried to shrink around me. The investigation didn't stop when he was taken away. In fact, it grew. Officers visited the hospital countless times. Detectives asked for details I hadn't remembered at first. They reconstructed the fall, the scene, the staircase, the angle, the bruises. They examined messages, bank statements, security footage, the altered insurance policy. His mistress eventually broke under pressure. The weight of guilt or fear or self-preservation, I'll never know, and admitted what he had told her, that he didn't mean for it to go that far, that he panicked, that he thought I'd be gone quickly. Every word, every syllable she confessed was another nail in the coffin he built for himself. I didn't even need to hate her. Life had already punished her with the truth. When the trial began, I wasn't required to be there. The judge offered to let me submit written statements, but I chose to stand, literally, in that courtroom. The walk from the hallway to the witness stand felt like climbing a mountain barefoot, but I did it, slowly, deliberately. My cane tapped against the floor, but my heart moved ahead of me. He looked at me with disbelief, as if I was a ghost he never expected to see walking again. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw fear. Not the fear he caused, but the fear of being seen by the woman he tried to erase. I sat down with care, adjusted the microphone, and told the truth. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with clarity. I said everything: the fall, the years of manipulation, the way he isolated me, minimized me, made me question myself, and then I described the moment he pushed me. The silence in the courtroom thickened like fog. He shook his head, muttered under his breath, but the evidence was already stacked high above any lie he could attempt. I ended my testimony with one sentence. I begged my body to live that day, and it did. The room stayed quiet long after I stepped down. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Guilty. Attempted murder. Aggravated domestic violence. Fraud. The sound of the gavel echoed inside my bones like a release I had been craving since the moment I hit the bottom of the stairs. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply breathed. A long, deep inhale that tasted like freedom and iron, and the end of a chapter that had nearly swallowed me whole. When I left the courthouse, the sun hit my face the same way it had the day I left the hospital. Warm, gentle. A reminder that the world keeps moving even when we break, and that sometimes it waits for us to return. Healing after the verdict wasn't sudden. Trauma doesn't evaporate just because justice is served. Nights were still hard. I still woke up sweating sometimes, hearing echoes of voices that no longer existed anywhere near me. But the difference was that now I knew those echoes were memories, not warnings. I slept in a new room, in a new home, painted in colors I chose myself, with furniture arranged to feel open instead of suffocating. I relearned routines, making coffee, cooking breakfast, opening windows without flinching at the breeze. I learned how to enjoy silence instead of fearing it. I rediscovered music, books, sunlight on my skin, conversations that didn't make my stomach twist. I was becoming someone I had never allowed myself to be, whole. And the walking, the walking. Every week, I added a few more steps, from the living room to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the porch, from the porch to the sidewalk. There was a day, I remember it like a photograph, when I walked the entire block alone for the first time. My legs shook, my breath wavered, but I kept going. Neighbors waved. A dog barked. A child rode a bike past me. The world felt normal again. On that walk, I whispered to myself, "You survived." And I let the truth settle deep inside my bones. That day, I didn't feel like the woman who was pushed. I felt like the woman who got up. One afternoon, my therapist asked me what I wanted for my future. Not what I was afraid of, not what I needed to heal, but what I wanted. It shocked me how long it took to answer. Wanting had been a forbidden luxury in my marriage, but slowly, words formed. I want peace. I want joy. I want movement. I want to live without apology. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want him to suffer. Justice had already done its job. What I wanted was mine. A life rebuilt in my own image. A life where love didn't hurt. Where silence wasn't punishment. Where my body wasn't a battleground. The first time I danced again, alone in my living room, slow music playing softly, I cried. Not from sadness, but from awe. My feet remembered rhythm. My body remembered freedom. My soul remembered lightness. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. That moment taught me something. Survival isn't the final chapter. Rebirth is. And I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was reclaiming, rewriting, rebuilding. People often ask me if I forgive him. I don't. Not because I'm filled with hate, far from it, but because forgiveness is not owed to the person who tried to kill you. Forgiveness, I learned, is something you give yourself. I forgave myself for staying, for not seeing the signs sooner, for believing his words over my instincts, for trusting someone who treated me like an object. That forgiveness was liberating. The past no longer chained me. The fall no longer defined me. The trauma no longer owned me. I walked away from all of it, slowly, painfully, triumphantly. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the woman who lay paralyzed in a hospital bed listening to her funeral being planned. I don't see the victim at the bottom of a staircase. I don't see the woman who couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't scream. I see someone reborn, someone forged in survival, someone who didn't die when death was convenient to someone else. I see strength in places where fear once lived. I see softness in places where pain once ruled. I see life. Real, unapologetic, breathtaking life. My scars don't haunt me anymore. They remind me. They are proof, not of violence, but of resurrection. Proof that I held on when everything pushed me to let go. Proof that I rose when someone tried to bury me. Proof that no matter how hard I fell, I got back up. And if I learned anything from this story, it's this. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is simply live. And living, for me, became an act of defiance. Every morning I opened my eyes was a refusal to disappear. Every breath I took was a contradiction to the narrative he tried to write for me. Every step I took was a reclamation of territory he thought he owned. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, quiet moments, like drinking coffee without glancing over my shoulder, or hearing footsteps behind me in a grocery store and not flinching, or walking into a room without checking the exit first. Healing was not a single triumph. It was thousands of tiny rebellions stitched together over time. My mother worried about me constantly, hovering, checking, asking if I was okay even when I smiled and said yes. She carried her own guilt, the guilt of every parent who thinks they should have known, should have seen, should have intervened sooner. I held her hands one night at the dining table and told her, "None of this was your fault." She cried the way only a mother can cry, full of love and regret and relief. I realized then that my healing wasn't just mine. It touched everyone who loved me. They too had been wounded by his actions. They too needed closure. And we healed together, slowly, intertwined, mending each other like a quilt patched with shared grief and renewed strength. There were moments when trauma tried to creep back in. Sometimes I would walk down the stairs in my new home and feel my legs freeze halfway down. My therapist taught me grounding techniques. Touch the railing, feel the texture, breathe deeply, name 5 things I can see, 4 things I can touch, 3 things I can hear. Each time, reality gently pulled me back from the grip of memory. Eventually, the staircase lost its power over me. One day, I walked down all 15 steps without stopping once. At the bottom, I placed my hand on the wall, looked up, and whispered, "I win." The nightmares also began to fade. At first, they were relentless, reliving the fall, the silence, the helplessness, hearing his voice as if he stood beside the bed again. But over time, my brain stopped replaying the moment he pushed me and started replaying the moment I took my first step in the hospital. The nightmares turned into dreams of movement, dreams of escape, dreams of light. My mind had finally chosen a different ending. Months passed, and my progress became something I no longer measured by pain, but by possibility. I walked without a cane. I traveled to a nearby town with my mother, sitting by the window as the scenery rushed by, feeling something inside me settle for the first time in a long time. I laughed more often. I slept through the night. I ate full meals. I woke up without that numb dread under my ribs. My body began to trust the world again, and my soul, that fragile thing I once thought was permanently cracked, began to feel whole. There came a day when I decided I wanted to visit the hospital again, not as a patient, but as a woman who survived. I wanted to thank them, the nurse who noticed my eyelid twitch, the doctor who protected me, the supervisor who barred my husband, the security guard who stood at my door, the team who saved me. When I walked into that hallway, every step echoing softly against the floor, nurses gasped, doctors smiled, the physiotherapist ran toward me crying. They gathered around like family. The nurse who saved me hugged me so tightly that for a moment I felt like the frightened, paralyzed woman I once was. And then, just as quickly, I felt like the reborn woman I had become. "You made it," she whispered. And I answered, because you saw me. The courtroom became a distant memory. The pain became a distant echo. The fear became a distant shadow. What stayed was the strength. What stayed was the clarity. What stayed was the knowledge that I could survive anything, because I had already survived the worst. My life no longer revolved around what happened to me. It revolved around what I would do next. I joined a support group for survivors of domestic violence, not because I needed constant help anymore, but because I realized I had something to give. The first meeting I attended, I sat quietly at the back, observing. Women shared stories so raw and familiar that my hands trembled under the table. Their voices cracked on the same words mine once did. Confusion, shame, fear, guilt. I raised my hand only at the end. My husband tried to kill me, I said. The room went silent. And I lived. And if I lived, you can live too. A woman in the front row broke into tears. Another reached for my hand. And I understood then that my survival was not just a personal victory. It was a shared lighthouse for those still lost at sea. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since before my relationship swallowed pieces of me whole. I wrote about the hospital, the staircase, the mirror, the moment my voice returned, the sound of the handcuffs, the feeling of my feet on the ground, the day I walked across the block alone, the moment I danced in my living room. My journal overflowed with pieces of rebirth, recorded in ink as proof that the woman he tried to erase had rewritten herself. Seasons changed. Winter softened into spring, and I felt the shift inside me as well. I stopped counting how many days it had been since the fall. I stopped checking the locks twice every night. I stopped avoiding shadows in empty rooms. And one afternoon, as I sat by the window watching rain slide down the glass, I realized I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen anymore. I was simply living, and that was more miraculous than any medical recovery. One day I visited a nearby park with my friend. Children ran past us. Dogs barked happily. Families picnicked under trees. As we walked along the path, a little girl tripped and fell. She looked up, surprised by the impact, still processing what had happened. And then, slowly, cautiously, she got up. Her mother clapped. The girl smiled shyly, dusted her knees, and continued running. I watched her and felt something tighten in my chest. That tiny moment was a mirror of my own life. The falling, the pause, the rising, the continuation. For the first time, I didn't see myself as the woman who had been pushed. I saw myself as the woman who stood up afterward. And that distinction changed everything. In time, my body grew stronger than it had ever been before. I exercised not out of fear, but out of pride. I ran a little. I hiked small trails. I breathed in open spaces. I took up yoga. I felt balance return to me, physically, mentally, spiritually. My therapist said something that echoed deep inside me. Your trauma will always be a part of your story, but it no longer gets to be the author. And she was right. I wasn't erasing my past. I was putting it in the correct chapter. There were days when I visited the staircase in my new home intentionally. I climbed it. I descended it. I sometimes sat on the steps and simply breathed. I reclaimed the narrative of stairs. They no longer symbolize the fall. They symbolize the climb. They symbolize the journey up. Months later, on a quiet morning, I woke up and realized something extraordinary. I didn't think about him anymore. Not consciously, not in fear, not in anger. He was simply gone from the center of my life, and in that empty space he left behind, something beautiful grew. Possibility. I began dreaming again, dreaming of trips, projects, new relationships, friendships, joy. I allowed myself to imagine a life bigger than survival, a life rooted in freedom, not in escape, a life full of beauty, not fear. And that's when I understood the truth buried beneath every struggle, every tear, every painful step. Survival is not the end of the story, it is only the beginning. And in the beginning that followed, life unfolded in ways I could never have imagined when I lay trapped inside my own silent body in that hospital bed. The world didn't suddenly become perfect, far from it, but it became mine, entirely, fiercely, quietly mine. I woke up every morning with the kind of gratitude that doesn't show up in words but in breath, in the way my feet touched the floor, in the way I stretched my arms without flinching, in the way sunlight painted my walls. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. I was living in moments instead of fearing them. Days were no longer counted by survival, but by experiences. The first time I cooked my favorite meal again. The first time I drove a car alone. The first time I laughed so loudly I startled myself. I began reconnecting with people I had lost along the way. friendships I had abandoned because isolation is one of the first symptoms of emotional control. One friend, Melissa, cried when she saw me. She hugged me so tightly my ribs hurt, but it was the kind of pain that reminded me I was alive, that I was held, that I was loved. "You disappeared," she said softly, brushing tears from her cheeks. And for the first time, I was ready to tell someone the truth. I didn't tell her everything at once. Some truths arrived like avalanches, not sentences, but I told her enough. She held my hand and whispered, "I'm here now," and she was. As time passed, the story of what happened to me stopped being a wound and became a scar. Still a mark, still a reminder, but no longer bleeding. I could talk about it without trembling. I could think about it without drowning. I could share it without breaking. The women in the support group often asked me, "How did you do it? How did you survive?" And my answer was always the same. I didn't do it alone. People saved me when I couldn't save myself. That was the truth. It was the nurse who noticed my eyelid, the doctor who believed me, the therapist who pieced me together, the police who listened, the strangers who cared more about my life than the man who vowed to love me ever did. But it was also me, the part of me that refused to die even when my body couldn't move, the part that whispered from inside the darkness, "Fight." There came a day, months after the trial, months after the guilt, months after the fear, when I realized I hadn't thought about the staircase in weeks. I walked into my home and felt calm from the doorway to the kitchen to the bedroom. My body no longer braced itself. My soul no longer tightened. And when I went to sleep that night, I dreamed of standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, wind in my hair, waves hitting the rocks below. In the dream, no one stood behind me. No one pushed me. I stood there, steady, powerful, untouched. I woke up with tears in my eyes because even my subconscious was finally letting me go. Eventually, I felt strong enough to travel. Nothing extravagant, just a small trip to a coastal town I used to love before everything changed. The smell of salt in the air felt like medicine. The sound of waves was a lullaby I hadn't heard in years. I walked barefoot in the sand, feeling each grain beneath my feet as if rediscovering texture itself. I let the ocean wash over my ankles, cold and alive, and I whispered into the wind, "Thank you. Not for what happened, never for that, but for the strength that came after. For the people who caught me, for the version of myself that rose from the ruins, for the life that waited patiently for me to return." When I got home from that trip, I began writing. Not journaling, writing. I wrote my story, not as a tragedy, but as a rebirth. I wrote each chapter with the care of someone stitching their own skin back together. I wrote about the hospital, the silence, the first twitch, the whisper, the first step, the courtroom, the aftermath, but I didn't end it with him being convicted. That wasn't the end. I ended it with something much simpler. Me dancing in my living room. Because that moment, that slow, shaky, joyous dance, was the real victory. One day, my therapist asked if I had ever considered sharing my story publicly. Not for attention, but to help others who felt trapped the way I once did. I thought about it for a long time. About the women still living in silence. About the ones who believe they're imagining the pain, exaggerating the fear, deserving of mistreatment. About the ones who think they won't be believed. I realized something important. Survival without purpose felt incomplete. My story wasn't meant to stay locked inside me. It was meant to be a hand reaching out into the dark for someone else. So, eventually, I said yes. I spoke at my first awareness event in a small community center. My voice trembled at first, but the moment I looked into the eyes of the women sitting in the front row, I found my strength again. I told them everything. The truth, the fall, the silence, the resurrection. I told them about the nurse who saved me, about the first step, about reclaiming my life inch by inch. I told them they were not alone. And when I finished, the applause felt like a wave, like a collective breath, like healing spreading from one heart to another. A woman approached me afterward, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Because of you, I think I can leave." In that moment, I understood the full power of survival. It wasn't just for me, it was for every woman who needed proof that escape was possible. In time, the question changed. People stopped asking, "How did you survive?" and started asking, "How did you rebuild?" And rebuilding became something I was proud of. I filled my home with softness, warm blankets, candles that smelled like vanilla and cedar, photographs of places I loved. I cooked meals that nourished me, played music that brought me joy, read books that reminded me how vast the world was. I laughed loudly. I cried freely. I learned to trust again slowly, carefully, like someone touching fire for the second time. Eventually, I opened my heart to love again, not because I needed it, but because I finally believed I deserved it. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a dramatic confession. It was gentle, slow, patient. He met me where I was, not where he wanted me to be. He never raised his voice, never made me doubt my memory, never made me feel small. He asked before touching me. He listened when I spoke. He stayed when I trembled. He said, "I'm not here to replace your past. I just want to be part of your future." And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that love could be safe. But even then, the greatest love I found was the one I learned to give myself. The love that says, I deserved better. The love that says, I am enough. The love that says, I survived. I didn't just heal. I grew. I didn't just stand. I walked. I didn't just live. I thrived. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think back to that hospital room where I lay still and silent, listening to my funeral being planned. I think about the woman who couldn't blink, who couldn't speak, who couldn't move, and I want to take her hand across time and tell her, hold on. You have no idea how beautiful your life is going to become. And if there is one thing, one message, I could carve into the universe for every woman who has ever been afraid, it is this. You can rise from anything, even from the place where someone tried to end you, especially from there,